Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dianne Smith, and on behalf of the Melbourne Chamber of Commerce, welcome to another COVID-19 webinar for business leaders. Today, we're exploring business survival strategies and being ready to deal with the real crisis. And for this dramatically titled webinar, we're joined by one of our members, Roger Perry, the Managing Director of the Bevington Group. Roger's an organisational transformation expert who works regularly with blue chip clients to improve productivity and performance. Today, Roger will share insights for business on the frameworks for responding and adapting to the challenges. He'll also look at how we manage unknowns and the latest in risk and resilience thinking, implications for organisational culture and leadership, and what can be learned from the organisations who are actually responding well. So thank you very much for joining us. It's a really timely and important topic. I'm sure you'll gain insights, not just on business survival, but also how we can grow stronger post-COVID-19. I'd like to acknowledge the Vecchi President on the line today, Karen Sobels, the Deputy President, Adrian Cloden, our past President, Don Rankin, and some board directors who are on the line, Jeremy Blackshaw and Michelle Windsor. So today's session, as usual, will start with an update on Vecchi's advocacy on behalf of business by the CEO, Paul Guerra. And at any stage from now onwards, please feel free, and we encourage you to send any questions through the chat function. So anything for Roger or for Paul. I'll be facilitating the Q&A just after 1:30. So over to you, please, Paul.
Thanks, Dianne, and welcome everybody. 317 cases. It's not where we want to be. It's the highest single day that we've seen, and really does make it difficult to see an end to this lockdown any sooner than the 6 weeks that we're in. Now, the only positive I can take out of it is I know that they're testing in areas where they know the virus is. So that is at least one small positive that we can take out of it. There's a lot of speculation. I know the Premier hit that again today. There's a lot of speculation around stage 4. Rest assured, our advice to the government is under no circumstances should we move to stage 4, because that would just kill business. I know they're not contemplating it at this point. However, if business felt that was an option, they'd like to receive our advice on that. But as I said, it's not something that we're pushing for at all. In fact, quite the opposite. You would have seen the support packages announced last week, now starting to come live, so the $5,000 grant. There's still some details around the hospitality and the CBD fund. The Victorian Chamber will be sitting on both of those as well. So as more details on that comes to hand, we'll certainly let you know. But as you can appreciate, I think the distraction around the high numbers has meant that some of the details around that hasn't come as quickly as what we might like it to. You'll also hear more about masks. I know that the government was talking around highly recommending masks. They may go to mandating masks, so you should at least start thinking about in your business what you might do from a mask perspective as well. We wrote to the Federal Treasurer. It got to him early this week. Quite simply, we believe JobKeeper should be extended. We also think that to get cash into the Victorian businesses' hands quickly, the best way to do that is waiving the June quarter BAS payments and then either deferring or reducing the September quarter BAS payments as well. You know, unfortunately for Victorian businesses, a lot of those are going to be compromised through September quarter, given the lockdown that we're in. We wanted to get some certainty around energy pricing, so the energy regulator setting some price points on that. In terms of infrastructure, Australia's priority list for Victorian investments, getting some consistency and certainty around that. Obviously, we're after additional funding allocation for some of the local and statewide road and other infrastructure projects. And then lastly, and we're seeing it certainly headline today's newspapers, is around the apprenticeships and traineeships. So additional support for them. So if what is reported in today's newspaper is announced later today, I'll be delighted with that, because that has been a real concern of ours. The drop in apprentice and traineeship numbers has been quite concerning. So that's probably been the week for us, Di, just making sure that we maintain connection with the state government, but obviously in this instance, moving to the federal government as well. Hand you back to Di.
Thanks very much, Paul. Okay, so it's now my great pleasure to introduce Roger Perry. We're very, very fortunate to have Roger joining us today. He's one of the region's foremost productivity improvement and organisational design experts. As Managing Director of the Bevington Group, he's assisted so many organisations, including Westpac, Qantas, ANZ, Energy Australia, the University of Melbourne and the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And I know we have Scott Chapman, the Managing Director of the RFDS on the line today. Special welcome to you, Scott. Roger's so well qualified to share his insights and he's certainly in a position to talk about who's managing the crisis well. So get ready for a rapid-paced 30-minute presentation, which of course will be available afterwards. And it's now my pleasure to invite Roger to address you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dianne. And I'll just make sure that the screen is up and running and that you can all see it okay. Can everyone see Dianne? Excellent. All right. Now, it will be rapid paced, so apologies for that, but it will be online, and thank you for making sure that's the case. And today we're going to talk about a reality which is, in our view, and in the view of many of our clients, we're in the very, very early stages of the crisis, and that the real impacts actually haven't been felt yet. So therefore, we're going to talk about ways that you can deal with that. What does the research tell us? Certainly the useful parts of the research, and then what does good practice tell us? And we'll sprinkle this through from examples as to who's actually doing well. We won't concentrate so much on who's not doing well, but we'll give you some examples of who's doing well and some examples of resilience activity. So we'll move on, and I'll start with this. And when this goes up later on today, this can act as a bit of a checklist. I'm not going to go through every one of these bullet points, but on the left-hand side, you'll see some of the actions that people took immediately for those organizations that had an immediate revenue hit. Now, not everybody did, but they still need to apply some of the lessons that exist in this pack, and we'll come to that later. But for those who had a revenue hit, an awful lot of the left was there. You had some target-based reduction. It reflected immediately in targets. You had staff on furlough. You had reviewing discretionary spend of all types, etc., etc. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I will say that each one of these, left, which is the immediate actions, and right, the soon tactical, can all be seen through the lenses of what we're about to take you through now, and they'll help you make decisions about what on this list you can deploy and what on this list is actually missing for you, but nonetheless, this acts as a good checklist. So you're already acting. Everyone on the phone will have already been doing something. It's simply not possible to sit in your hands during this particular crisis. So what does the research tell us, and what does good practice tell us are the best ways to think about resilience? So if you're going to have to survive an ongoing crisis, it's many more weeks of lockdown here in Victoria that will affect the rest of the national economy as well. And therefore, there will be longer term economic impacts. So the world is not going to return to normal. What do you need to know? Well, broadly speaking, there are two general themes in organizational resilience. One is fortification. These are things like making sure you have reserves. Pretty tough if you've already used them. It's actually making sure that your legal structures are appropriate, that if one part of the business goes down, it doesn't drag everything else with you. So that's a sort of thing that fortification involves, and it also involves standard risk management practices. We'll talk about those in a few minutes' time. And very importantly, it talks about understanding where you're vulnerable. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, adaptability is different. So fortification gives you time to survive. Adaptability allows you to basically adjust to the new normal. So if we think of fortification being things like the banks having enough capital in reserve, and we think of adaptability as the banks, for example, having to pivot really, really strongly to provide support packages to small businesses, essentially holding their interest payments and putting a bit of a payment holiday on, that would be an example of an adaptation. But adaptation goes much, much deeper, and we'll talk about that as we roll. Now, we'll also refer to this model. So resilience, so fortification adaptation, which is what do you do from a P&L management perspective? What does the research and practice tell us? And from the GFC, we know exactly, statistically, what the best steps are. And this is a theme of research that started in 2010, and you can see all of this in action today, and I'll give you examples as we go through. You start with early cost out, absolutely. You've seen it all over the place. You certainly see, for example, thousands of Qantas workers who have been laid off, or thousands of retail workers who are on furlough or being laid off. It's all over the press. But much more hidden, but definitely real, is the move to productivity. Productivity isn't just about cost, it's about unit costs. And whereas cost out might damage the muscle of the organization, so you can actually spring out of this when conditions ease or improve, productivity is a benefit that you get to keep. You get to keep it for the short term, you get to keep it for the long term. You need to move quickly into growth planning. To do that, you need to know the next item, which is how are your customers' needs changing? What do you have to do differently? And we'll talk a little bit about that and provide some examples as we go. But if you know where your customers' needs changes, you can do some growth planning. So for example, Unilever, they've actually basically focused their products on things that matter. So a lot of their activities around hand sanitizers, best desk sanitizers, etc., etc. Airbnb have basically adapted. Let's go back to that adaptation and resilience piece, where now they're talking about bringing experiences from their providers online to ensure there's a connectivity with providers for when their business wakes back up again, because you can imagine their business has been absolutely hammered. All of this gives you a great balance. You do need to follow those 4 steps, is what the research says. And the resilience thinking we've just shown you enables you to follow those 4 steps. So let's explore this in a little bit more depth. So the first thing to say is, look, the sweet spot, quite clearly from what we are seeing, is for those who have a balanced response, looking after their P&L by keeping an eye on the customer in effect, short-term cost actions, yes, but moving to productivity, moving to growth planning, looking where the customer needs are, and resilient thinking. So thinking even now about what it would take to fortify their organization and actually working hard on adaptation. The good news is that Australia, generally speaking, has been more adaptive than it suspected it was. So most organizations in the early stage, certainly in the first lockdown, reported that they were more flexible than they thought. And I have spoken to well over 100 organizations. So that's definitely a consistent theme. The challenge is some of this flexibility, collaboration, and adaptation is starting to wane. More on that a little bit later. So let's look at resilience in a little bit more detail. This is something leaders need to know. Fortification and adaptation are the 2 core pillars of resilience thinking. It's grouped together in the research. The research is a little bit all over the place, so you've got to parse through it. But we've been doing it for 10 years, so I've got a pretty clear view on what's there. And there's no doubt that you can see this thinking happening in practice in the markets. So let's talk through it. Now, the first thing when people think about resilience, they think about the risk management plans. And in fact, we are reviewing a series of risk management plans at the moment. But it's important, it's a necessary condition. But of course, many of you will know that your BCPs didn't actually apply to this particular condition. They weren't sufficient. So a backup site doesn't help you when no one can go on site, for example, in a BCP sense. So traditional risk planning is identify a risk, assess the probability, assess the impact, come up with a treatment plan. But many of the plans that we've looked at have basically missed either the point, because basically the risks that they imagined weren't the risks that were envisaged. We'll talk about how to deal with that in a minute. Or they didn't actually implement the 4 key things that you can do in a risk treatment plan. You can reduce the probability, maybe. You can reduce the impact, maybe, for example, by having some sort of buffer in place. So a buffer, for example, might be stores, supplies. You can have a contingency plan. What do? Switch suppliers, for example, if a supply link breaks. And very importantly, notice the problem earlier. There's plenty of research and examples of cases of organizations which notice a problem early and can act on it. Now, but actually, traditional risk planning is simply not sufficient, because actually not many organizations had in their risk plans as a major thing to plan for a global viral crisis. It just wasn't present in many places, which is why the BCPs weren't quite fit for purpose. Fukushima did traditional risk planning. It didn't anticipate that a tsunami would basically destroy the diesel generators, which were down at sea level. Paris SCOF had all sorts of known risks, but the organization still blew up and had to be bailed out again effectively. So traditional risk planning is actually filled with flaws. And one of the flaws is you've got to imagine the risk. What's the alternative? So the alternative is vulnerability thinking. You don't know the precise risks, but you get good at identifying where you're vulnerable. So you know you've got tightly bound supply chains. You know, for example, you've got one supplier. You know you rely on the supplier being able to deliver just in time, for example. You know you don't have much reserve stock. Doesn't matter what problem occurs, that's a vulnerability. If you know you've got offshore supply and you rely on telecommunication links or civil order in that society, then you know you've got a vulnerability there, even though you don't know what might happen. And in fact, in this case, let's take both of those. We had supply chain problems at the beginning, getting masks and protective equipment. In fact, early on, we actually just didn't have enough kit. If we'd have had a peak earlier on, we would have been in a world of pain. There were hospitals we were working with who didn't even have face shields for their ICU staff. So we weren't ready. Now we got over that, which is great, or I think we've got over that. So outsourced service provision as well. We have clients who'd outsourced to the Philippines and India. The services effectively entirely broke down. Because if you think about it, those people who go home from their offices don't necessarily have great internet connection. Working from home is not a superb option for them. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I will point out the one in the bottom right-hand corner, and that is heavily bureaucratic processes, slow decision-making processes are actually a form of vulnerability. If you can't spin on a dime in the event of a crisis, you might find yourself either making a decision too late or actually making a late and a bad decision, which is not fantastic. So when you understand your vulnerabilities, you don't need to know the specific risk. You're planning around vulnerabilities, and it's an advance forward in the fortification thinking. Okay, now let's look at adaptability. Now, this is exceptionally important because basically fortification buys you time to deal with a global new normal. Adaptability allows you to adjust. If you're already adaptable, you don't need to get there. For those who aren't terribly adaptable, now's a good time to think about how you get there. What does it mean? Well, the first point is adaptation isn't one feature of your organization. You can't just change one thing and job done. An operating model is the term we use for all the different elements that you need to execute on a strategy and a mission. So if your job is, for example, your Australia Post, to deliver packages to homeowners, your problem actually is adaptability so that you can deal with actually bottlenecks, supply issues. How do you actually scale up to deal with the increased load? Whereas you've got entirely different problems, as I said, if you're at Airbnb, which has just had its business dry up. So these are operating model changes. So to be more adaptive, you've probably got to change your policies. You've probably got to change the way your role works. You've probably got to change your metrics. And you've probably got to change the way you manage work management discipline minimum. Now, it's an entire other session to talk in depth about operating model change, but you won't be just changing one thing if you truly want to be able to adapt. So let's take some examples. You might be changing your sourcing. So if you've got offshored supply chains, you might want a backup plan to your single provider or your 3 providers that all happen to be in the same country. Management discipline. You might look at it and go, okay, what makes me more vulnerable from an adaptable perspective is management discipline. I want actually to change the way management work so that they can make decisions more appropriately and faster. And I'll talk a little bit about what some of those options around management discipline might be. I might change my legal structure, it's an operating model perspective, to allow independent operation of some of the units, but also so that they're protected in the event that one of them goes bust, and that will happen. Information, the ability to sense early, the earlier you know what's going on, the earlier you can respond, and functional design. The lean corporate center is back. Centralization is actually also back, by the way. That does not, lean corporate center, we mean those, I guess, command and control functions in and around head office. It doesn't mean operations centrally. Okay, So you've got to think about your operating model as a whole if you want to be adaptable. And you can tell that adaptable thinking connects into the vulnerability thinking that we were talking about earlier. But if you do want actually to deal with resilience, if you want to actually deal with vulnerabilities, if you actually want to be more adaptable, you've got to do so in a way that's cost effective. Because if you're too expensive, if your operations are too expensive, that is a form of fragility. You can't respond, you can't build your reserves, you can't offer the customer on a sustainable basis a great deal in the short term. But on the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that decentralization is actually a great way to increase local adaptation because conditions can be different locally. So how do you bring those models together? There's plenty of research and examples. So McDonald's, for example, they allow a lot of local empowerment, but within very strict bounds, and the bounds are set centrally. So there are ways, for example, you can increase adaptation, which is generally more decentralization of local business units as one of the ways to do it. There are exceptions, and I'll come to that in a few minutes' time. And at the same time, manage costs. That being said, centralization, virtual centralization, where people are actually operating from their homes, is a theme and a trend. And it's a trend basically because of cost, but also to be able to move quickly nationally. So it's a little bit of complexity in this, but the lesson is there are models actually that allow you to be adaptable and manage your costs. Now, also, culture is extremely important from an adaptation perspective. The reality is that some cultures are inherently more adaptable to others. Now, I'll pause for thought here. You won't fix this just by a culture program. I'll go back to the operating model design. If you want to fix your culture, you've got to do all sorts of different things. It's role design, it's the way you structure it, it's your policies, it's your processes, it's your rewards, it's your measures. So this is not an overnight thing to move, although we have seen people move it quite quickly over the last few weeks even. But notwithstanding, it is. So important things from a cultural perspective. You need a common and well understood goal. You need transparent ways of working through problems. You need to see mistakes as learning opportunities and not fire people for making a mistake. So the old story goes, essentially, when an operator had actually made a terrible mistake in a manufacturing plant, the operator asked, "Are you going to fire me?" And the boss said, "Well, that mistake's just cost $2 million. That's $2 million in training. I'm certainly not going to fire you now." And that's the sort of attitude that you actually need. But also there's a willingness to share credit. Now, all of this, transparency, mistakes seen as learning opportunities, and a willingness to share credit, are all features of something that we call collaboration. And we're all calling it collaboration. And collaboration has actually improved substantially. So we see it all over the place. In government, we see an adaptive response in collaboration where people from one department or government entity have been shifted both at state and federal level to another government department to be able to cope with load. For example, the Department of Human Services has received an awful lot of staff from other places to be able to cope with the enormous load of people on, for example, Job Seeker or the tax office for its increased activities. Now, that's all fantastic, but there is something which we call the Christchurch effect. The Christchurch effect is what happened in Christchurch after their earthquake. There was a lift in collaboration and it was followed by a return to normal, causing enormous frustration in the population who just didn't see things getting done fast enough, including working through their own insurance issues. So basically, the lesson actually on adaptation and all of this, including the cultural benefit, if you want to keep the benefits that have arisen in terms of adaptation from this particular crisis, you're going to have to plan to do it. It will not happen by itself. It's a conscious decision. Now, I don't have time to go through all of these particular activities, but certainly a number of things are probably a couple more things I'd like to draw attention to you. Speedy and efficient execution of promises being the most important one. Speed is extremely important. There's no question that one of the things you've got to do, let's take that balanced response when you go through those particular stages. You do want to do it faster than your competition. You do want to respond faster than your competition to be able to get the job done. And we are seeing some very good adaptation responses. Now, examples of this that we see today, organizations that have done particularly well. We know of one particular law firm that spent an awful lot of time thinking about its culture. It's doing very, very well. They're hanging together well. They're doing tremendously well in terms of collaboration, and they can do that well because they've invested in the groundwork of a really clear cultural precept. So there are plenty of examples around, but you will need to, if you've actually got a benefit out of this particular crisis, actually plan to do something to keep it. All right. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit more about leadership and management discipline. So one of the ways you can actually get to this sort of culture where you've got effectively plenty of collaboration and you've got speed is mission-directed leadership. Now, mission-directed leadership is a concept that has something of a military background, but actually of late, it's been much more about saving lives than taking lives, I'm very glad to say. So let's take a bushfire example. We go back to the Californian bushfires more than 10 years ago, where whole fire teams were wiped out and killed because they were waiting for instructions from head office. Effectively, this model, and it's not always appropriate, but it often is that you, within bounds, within very strict guidelines, you give local commanders the opportunity, or local managers the opportunity to make a decision. To be able to do that, they need to be clear on their mission. What are we here to do? Purpose is so important. Then they need to be trained and coached on how to make decisions given the information in front of them. So if there's no coaching, coaching is extremely important. Coaching is actually more important than training, because in adult learning, we can actually dissipate the lessons sometime afterwards if they're not actually embedded in the workforce and reinforced. So they're basically taught to make the decisions. So in the recent Californian bushfires, when communications went down, no firefighters died. Really important lessons from Australia in terms of mission-directed leadership as well, in terms of how we fight our bushfires, how our emergency services work, how our hospitals work, how our government agencies work, and indeed, how our businesses work. So very, very, very important concept. Now, leadership is also critically important because it helps us take another perspective on effectively agility. And one of them is the way you think about the challenge that you faced. Now, we can think about this challenge as all bad, and to be fair, there's a lot that's bad about it. Or you can think about it in terms that Taleb thinks about it. Now, Taleb is an outstanding business philosopher, organizational philosopher, and in fact, a resilience philosopher. Difficult to read in the sense that he's dripping with arrogance, but interesting to read. And he has written a book. He was the originator of the concept of black swan. Very relevant because many of us would say that a GVC is a classic black swan. Very difficult to predict. You don't really know if it's out there or not because we didn't know that black swans existed at one point in time, but its impacts were really, really, really big. Now, actually, Taleb has been helping some fund managers, and for the fund managers who've taken Taleb's advice, their returns have sometimes been reported in the thousands of percentage points. Thousands, literally thousands, over 10,000 in one particular case, because they bought the appropriate insurance for the long tail event. So that's lesson one from Taleb, which is the unexpected is to be expected, and that's why you need fortification and adaptation. And it's why you need to be well practiced in your thinking to go through the 4 stages of the balanced response. But Taleb has much more to say, and leaders need to understand it, and it takes real leaders to lead the organization this way. And one of the things that Taleb said is actually strength and resilience, or anti-fragility. Anti-fragility means you get stronger from stress, occurs when you stress and rest. Now, this is true of organizations. It's true of biological organisms. So there's a muscle there at the top. When you exercise, you stress your muscles, you stress your body, you stress your lungs, you stress your heart, you rest, you get stronger. If you don't rest and you keep stressing it, you'll eventually die. Not a good outcome. So in essence, what we're talking about here is a stress and rest cycle that leadership need to consciously manage. So one of the things we're actually seeing great leaders doing is being aware of stress and rest cycles. So how do you artificially create a rest cycle? How do you artificially actually reduce the pressure that people feel from actually, for example, being on digital media all day. And we now know there's plenty of research out that it actually introduces stresses and discombobulations, which is a fabulous word, that don't exist when you're actually meeting face-to-face. And bear in mind, not meeting face-to-face is actually a vulnerability. You miss the water cooler conversations. You do miss much of the depth in terms of signaling in social interaction. So there are some stresses. It's great, but there are some stresses that go with this. So you have to plan pseudo rests somehow for your team so you can stress and rest. You have to make your own fire breaks. Now, another extremely important point that Taleb makes is this is actually just part of evolution. He said stress and rest is an evolutionary process. Evolution actually breaks things before an organism gets better. So think about your organization, and of course leaders need to think about their own health, because this is a long journey. I think we're a couple of years before we're anywhere near really saying we're at the tail end or through this, but right or wrong, stress and rest. So the bottom point there, though, is this long tail events. We've been hit by the GVC. It proves something that Taleb was saying for a while, which long tail events, low probability events, which are high impact, do happen. If you think in your lifetime that this is the last black swan you'll find, you may well be disappointed. You actually have to get quite good at this. Bear in mind that on a planetary basis, we are more complicated because we are more populous. We have technologies and ways of doing things that very efficiently allow the spread, not just of actual viruses, but of cognitive viruses, ways of thinking and ways of behaving. There are all sorts of opportunities for a crisis. And one thing we know from systems thinking is that interconnections lead to faster transmission of any sort of virus, be it intellectual, social, cognitive, or otherwise, physical. Okay, another very important point for leaders to understand from Taleb's work is the concept of barbell thinking. Now, Taleb basically says that you've got two types of strategy. Strategy one, left-hand side of the barbell, is what you're doing at the moment. You're reducing your costs, you're being efficient, and you're trying to come up with some customer propositions that are broadly in line with the type of business that you have today. So I'm going to talk about Procter & Gamble. I was delighted to find that they 70% of their manufacturing here in Australia. That is actually a resilience strategy, and that's on the fortification side. But they also, of course, are pivoting to provide and manufacture the right goods and services and bring the right goods and services on board. Strategy two, though, is different. It's options thinking. Now, Taleb was an option theorist, and options thinking runs like this. I actually don't know what the upside is of this strategy. I'm going to build a strategy where I don't know the upside, but I do know the cost, and I'm prepared to pay that cost to get those. Now, those who will come out of this well will pay the cost to buy some options. So a classic example comes from the Brisbane River, and of course I'm referencing other disasters here. So when the Brisbane River flooded, one of our clients had bought an option. That option was to basically get the diggers, or a very large percentage of the diggers, they paid money for it, but not very much, in the event of a crisis. They had first right of refusal. They were able to clear their warehouses and their manufacturing facilities out faster, and they were able to get up running faster than anybody else because they had access to the very limited supply of diggers. That's an option. It's option thinking. We're working with other clients who are building, even now, extraordinary data science and digital capabilities because they actually don't know what the upside is of a data science capability, but they do know that they have to pay it if they really want to compete. So they're actually, some of this is an act of faith, but they do know how much it's going to cost. So you can afford it, you invest in it, but it's a different strategy to strategy one. Those organizations which are adaptive are usually those who are willing to invest in strategy two as well. And that's just a fact. So it's just one of those things. Now, but don't forget the balanced response. So I said at the beginning, you do need to still come back to the basics, and the basics are you need to do something about cost. The slide at the beginning, we gave you examples. The slide at the beginning, which had tactical now and tactical later, effectively, those are the ones that we see every single day dealing with organizations that are responding, and we're dealing with a lot of organizations. I've been probably since it started spoken to 100 management teams. So cost, productivity, look at the changing customer needs, and they absolutely are changing. They'll spend less and they'll spend it on different things. And once you've done that, then redesign your growth proposition, being aware of the vulnerabilities that we talked about when we were talking about resilience and fortification. So you do have to do that, and there's no doubt that the evidence from the GFC is that that was the case. Take simple example, Kmart. Kmart post-GFC in the US, it actually increased its margins from the GFC. How did it do that? It actually had basically noticed the change in customer buying behaviors and actually totally repivoted its online strategy and invested a huge amount in it. Now, I'm just going to talk about the productivity bit for a moment. Productivity is not cost out. It's usually the mistake that people make. Productivity is work out. The difference between cost out and productivity out, so productivity can and should lead to cost out, but it also can lead to growth in services at the same level of cost, but it's a reduction in unit cost and it's a means of strengthening. Cost out might strengthen you, or in the long term, it might weaken you. You will have to do some cost out if your revenue is under stress. That's absolutely known and understood. Your game, though, is to get rid of work. And if that's not what you're focusing on, you're missing a beat. And there's no doubt in the research that post-GFC, those that just did cost out, that did not do productivity, or even those that just invested in growth and didn't do productivity, did not do as well as organizations that did productivity and growth. You must do both. Productivity is extremely important. It does mean using technologies. It does mean re-engineering processes. It does mean restructuring. And it does mean having an exceptionally clear concept of where your waste is. This particular picture that we've got here is an example of an organization with 50% waste. This is actually not unusual. The average in Australia is about 37%. That means 3.7 days out of every 10, you're doing something with your staff, which is often your biggest cost, not always, but often, that's actually waste. Meaning you'd want to get rid of it if you possibly could, because it's adding no value to your customers or your stakeholders. So it's there. We've all got it, including my organization. We've all got waste that we can deal with. All right. So I've gone necessarily in a short webinar through this quite quickly, but it is worthwhile summarizing. So there are two broad concepts that we see in the Australian market today, and actually in overseas markets, that the very, very best of the leaders are actually operating under. They don't call it this. They might not have read the papers. Some of it's instinctive. One is the resilience thinking. And resilience thinking is split. Really, it's about thinking about vulnerabilities. It's about still building great risk plans, but thinking more broadly about vulnerabilities because you don't know what's happening. There might be another black swan. A lot of us didn't really want there to be, no, in fact, who wanted there to be a second spike? But also, it's also about adaptability. So resilience, fortification and adaptability, and a balanced response, stepping through from cost to productivity, from seeing the changing customer needs and actually having some sort of growth option. So they're constantly developing their plans, they're constantly looking, and the assumption that they're making is that it's far from over. Those who took a sigh of relief early because they thought that this was ending were disappointed. Never assume that it's over, is my advice for now. So the ancient Stoics assumed that there was always something bad around the corner. It didn't mean they were miserable. It just meant they were prepared. And that's exactly what we propose for you. Take the lessons from the ancient Romans. They were always prepared for the worst, but quite happy to see the beauty in life because they knew they were mentally prepared for the worst. You will need to be prepared for the worst. So vulnerabilities, resilience, balanced response. Remember that by responding well, if you stress and rest yourself, your staff, your organization, you'll have to be creative in terms of finding ways to rest, you will build a stronger organization. Stress and rest builds strength. To be able to do this, all of this, resilience thinking, vulnerabilities, fortification, adaptability, balanced response, you'll need to have the management team that's intellectually and culturally able to lead this. The management team that knows it's not about them, it's about their organization and their staff. Therefore, it is about collaboration. It's not about feathering your own nest, but working collaboratively. They'll have to lead by example to be able to get this job done. So there are some thoughts that hopefully will enable you to structure your own response to ongoing resilience. There's certainly the evidence, there's lots and lots of evidence in terms of how people are responding today that they meet those particular criteria. Not everyone actually does it all. And the bit that we're now only seeing emerge reasonably recently is the move to new models of operation. But even in the early stages, if to the final point, the 4 stages, we saw lots of adaptation. We saw organizations move from clothing to actually making face masks. We saw organizations taking existing products that were designed for mining to breathing systems in ICUs. And we've seen organizations that used to make gin that have actually made hand sanitizer. I would argue possibly that that is something they'll want to get back to soon, would be the gin, but there's no question there's plenty of adaptation shown. So we've seen it. We've seen the 4 stages, we've seen the cost cutting, we've seen the productivity. We've certainly seen the shifting of business models, and we'll see much more of it over the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Thank you.
My time.
Thank you so much, Roger. There was an incredible amount in that for everyone to consider. We've already had a couple of questions, a few questions come through, and I'd like to get straight to that, but just thank you very much for your presentation. I'm glad you finished with the Romans, because I actually think you're a business philosopher. So, but the first question I want to go to is, imagine you're in the visitor economy just now, so the tourism and event sector. They actually don't have customers or enough customers to trade. So I suppose, how can you be resilient when you're actually riding on the floor in that particular situation? What are the best options for organisations in that sector?
Yeah, look, it's a very specific question on depending on your business, but if you're Airbnb, for example, their response is actually to respond by sustaining the relationship. So in other words, they're actually offering digital and online services or enabling online services for some providers. So you're actually getting things like cooking classes being offered online rather than go to the hotel with a fabulous restaurant, or the sommelier offering wine courses and wine tasting courses. These are adaptive, resilient responses, but they won't replace the core revenue. So they're just enough to help you trickle through. So it's about being ready, but nonetheless, they're fantastic for your own adaptation. So restaurants, we're already certainly seeing restaurants pivoting and going to where they were heavily reliant on tourist income, pivoting and going to online delivery. Now, actually, as it happens, we are working with one state on their visitor economy. And whilst doing that, I was in a restaurant talking to a restaurant owner who owned several restaurants and had pivoted his entire menu. He'd actually changed in one of the suburbs his entire menu to be totally enabled and appropriate for simple online delivery and mass production, and increased revenue by 100% more than they were pre-COVID. So adaptation is possible. So we've got things like, for example, restaurants creating weekly menu plans. We've got actually pre-prepared meals actually being this, basically one of the standouts in terms of profitability. So there are actually ways to do it. But very bluntly, these will not replace the revenue. They're for operation with lower cost staff models. So therefore, what you've got to be doing now is absolutely pivot, develop new models, develop new channels, develop new ways to offer what you know and what you can do to your customers, relying on digital and delivery means if possible. But now you need to be thinking about, how do you actually come out of this? When we actually do come out of this, the competition for the visitor economy is going to be extreme. And it's not just international, the competition is going to be extraordinary cross-border. We're going to be at each other's throats to get visitors. So what you need to do is be ready for that experience. What is your compelling proposition? And here's the other thing, why are you safe to visit? So look, there's a lot to say about that, and I probably better not take half an hour.
Just one more quick question. This is from, and I should have said that was from Bindigo from Cooper Energy. This is from Michael Fattini, who's CFO at SCT Logistics. So I believe they supply all of the Woolworths. While businesses have adapted reasonably well to the use of technology and working from home, what are the downsides from this? You covered a little bit on this earlier, but are there other downsides longer term?
Yeah, look, I think there are quite substantial downsides. Longer term, I can see actually the best way is a mix, sometimes working from home, sometimes working from the office. But here are the downsides. At the end of the day, we're cave animals, right? We're actually evolved to work together in groups. So let's take, for example, one of the innovations in modern operations in terms of speed is to build a minimum viable product in an agile team. That actually can be done digitally, but it's harder. So you don't get the water cooler conversations, for example. You don't get the subtleties of signals that arise in a face-to-face meeting. And it is actually hard to build relationships. So for example, if you've already got a lot of relationships, and we're lucky in this regard, in that my organization, Bevington, has got a lot of relationships already, so we're just continuing. If you're trying to build some, it's actually much harder to build digital relationships if you haven't actually met face to face. So, but here's the other big problem. The other big problem is mental health. Now, at a webinar that you had recently, there was a discussion on deterioration of mental health in Australia. We're getting a lot of reports that that's an emerging issue, where we had actually a peak in productivity. Productivity improved in the early stages of lockdown. We'll now start to see that mental health issues will start to impact on that. And I know many of my clients are thinking about it, and we're actually thinking about it. We actually have mental health thinking as part of the way we're managing our staff, because it will start to create burdens and anxieties.
Thank you very much, Roger. Look, sadly, I think we're going to have to finish up soon. There's many other questions coming through, particularly about talent. How do we ramp up talent strategies? And look, I think the important thing is we've started a great conversation. You've provided an excellent framework for everyone to consider and to think about their own performance in the context of it. But we're going to have to finish up, because we promised everyone we'd finish at 1:45. So first up, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for your participation. I'd like to thank Paul Guerra and Roger Perry in particular for such a brilliant presentation. As we said earlier, you'll be receiving the slides, and the presentation is recorded. I'd also like to thank Dianne Perry and Crystal Eade from Bevington Group, and Dianne and Lucy from our team. The key message was going beyond the traditional risk thinking approach, and use these frameworks to consider vulnerabilities leading to strengthened resilience. And I think the key word was the balanced growth, or balanced growth approach. So fantastic, Roger. Given COVID-19 is far from over, this type of thinking puts us into a good mindset. Please stay connected with us at the Chamber of Commerce, because we can connect you to the thought leadership from people like Roger, and also all of the other information that you need to get on an ongoing basis. So we're here to support you in the challenges ahead, and we're committed to Victoria getting back to business safely soon. So our next webinar is with Minister Jacinta Allen, who'll be talking a lot, obviously, about transport and Victoria. It's on the 30th of July at 10 a.m. So until then, good afternoon, everyone.